In 2017, researchers compared the arm bones of Neolithic women with those of modern female athletes and found results that made current gym memberships look inadequate. The upper arm bone strength of these prehistoric women exceeded that of living female rowers who trained for multiple hours every day across many years. The difference was not mere similarity or near equivalence, but clear superiority. This means either those women somehow used an undiscovered ancient training system, or the long-standing popular picture of the passive cave woman who only gathered berries while men hunted has been incorrect for a long time. Let us examine this study in detail, because the specifics make it even more interesting than the main finding alone indicates. Researchers, led by Alison McIntosh at the University of Cambridge, analyzed the leg and arm bones of women who lived across roughly 6,000 years of early agricultural history in Central Europe. They compared the bone strength and density of these ancient women against modern groups that included runners, rowers, soccer players, and a sedentary control group. The findings showed that these prehistoric women's arm bones were not just strong, but displayed bone-loading patterns consistent with sustained, repetitive, demanding upper body labor over an entire lifetime. This matched the kind of cumulative physical stress expected from years of manual grain processing, hauling water, tending livestock, and general agricultural labor that does not appear at the same intensity in modern populations, even among trained athletes working specifically to build that kind of strength. This matters greatly because bone is not a static structure, but living tissue that actively remodels itself in direct response to mechanical stress throughout a person's life, according to a principle researchers call Wolff's law. Bones placed under repeated, sustained physical demand restructure themselves to handle that load more efficiently by becoming denser and developing reinforced ridges exactly where the stress concentrates. This means ancient skeletons are not just passive remains waiting for archaeologists to measure them, but essentially a detailed, permanent fitness record. They form a biological printout of exactly what kind of physical work a person spent their life doing, written directly into the architecture of their bones. So when researchers find prehistoric female skeletons with bone density and structural reinforcement rivaling or exceeding elite modern athletes, that is not some fluke of unusually strong individuals scattered randomly throughout the population. It is a clear signal that this level of physical demand was the normal, everyday baseline for women across this entire period, rather than an outlier. Now, here is where the popular cultural image of prehistoric life starts to fall apart under scrutiny. For a large portion of the 20th century, the dominant narrative in both popular media and a lot of academic archaeology was built around something often called the man-the-hunter model. Men went out chasing dangerous game using tools and strategy, while women stayed back at camp, gathering plants and minding children in a division of labor framed as both biologically inevitable and relatively low effort on the women's side. This model shaped museum, dioramas, textbook illustrations, and nearly every pop culture depiction of prehistoric life for generations. The problem is that once researchers started rigorously testing this model against physical evidence, rather than just assuming it reflected some universal, unquestionable truth about human nature, it began falling apart in dramatic ways. Let us discuss grain processing specifically, because this single, unglamorous, repetitive task turns out to explain an enormous amount of the bone strength data under discussion. Before mechanized milling existed, processing grain into usable flour required hours of daily repetitive grinding using a stone tool called a quern. This essentially meant leaning the entire upper body weight into pushing and dragging a heavy grinding stone back and forth, over and over, for hours, every single day, for an entire agricultural lifetime. Ethnographic and historical records from numerous traditional societies consistently identify this specific task as primarily, though not always exclusively, women's labor. Calculating the effects of that kind of repetitive, sustained, full-body resistance exercise across years and decades produces a much clearer biomechanical explanation for exactly the kind of upper arm bone density researchers found. This was not women lifting heavy things occasionally, but sustained near-daily multi-hour resistance training, even if nobody at the time called it that or thought to track personal records on it. Carrying loads represents another massive, frequently underestimated physical demand that fell heavily on women across countless traditional and prehistoric societies. Water needed to be hauled, sometimes over significant distances, and sometimes multiple times a day. Firewood needed to be gathered and carried. Children needed to be carried frequently, for years, often while simultaneously carrying additional gathered materials, food, or tools. Modern researchers studying contemporary hunter, gatherer, and agricultural groups have documented women routinely carrying loads representing a substantial percentage of their own body weight, sometimes for considerable distances and sometimes multiple times throughout a single day. This level of sustained, weighted functional strength training would make plenty of dedicated modern strength athletes take notice. Let us include hide processing as well, because this task receives almost zero attention in popular depictions of prehistoric life, despite being absolutely critical to survival in virtually every cold or temperate ancient environment. In numerous documented traditional societies, it was predominantly performed by women. Processing animal hide into usable supple leather is an enormously labor-intensive process, involving scraping, stretching, working, and manipulating tough, heavy material using sustained upper body force, sometimes for hours at a stretch, across multiple separate processing sessions for a single hide. This task alone would have demanded significant grip strength, forearm endurance, and shoulder stability. These are exactly the kind of physical demands that leave lasting, measurable marks on bone structure, over the kind of repeated, lifelong exposure that traditional clothing production would have required. Now, let us address something that genuinely upended a major piece of the the hunter narrative specifically. Direct archaeological evidence shows women actively participating in big game hunting, not just supporting hunters from camp, but actually engaging in the hunt itself. A landmark 2020 study examining a roughly 9,000-year-old burial site in the Andes called Willamaya Pajexa found a young adult female buried alongside a hunting toolkit specifically associated with big game hunting. Projectile points and animal processing tools were positioned in a way consistent with the kind of burial typically associated with hunters in that specific archaeological context. This single, well-documented burial pushed researchers to revisit older excavation data more broadly. Once they did, they found that out of a broader sample of similarly aged big-game hunter burials across the Americas, a significant percentage, somewhere in the range of 30 to 50%, depending on which specific dataset gets analyzed, were female. This suggests female participation in big-game hunting was not some rare, exceptional anomaly, but may have represented a meaningfully common, accepted role within these populations all along. This finding sent a noticeable ripple through the broader archaeological community, not because the underlying data itself was particularly shocking on a purely physical or logical level, but because it directly contradicted decades of assumed, often unquestioned interpretive frameworks that earlier archaeologists had applied almost automatically to burial sites containing hunting tools. For a long time, the default assumption was straightforward. A hunting toolkit in a grave equaled a male hunter with no further consideration needed. It took modern researchers actually applying rigorous skeletal sex determination methods directly to these burials, rather than just assuming gender based on grave goods using outdated cultural assumptions, to reveal that this default interpretation had been quietly, systematically wrong for a meaningful percentage of cases the entire time. This raises an important point worth considering carefully. A lot of what we have collectively assumed about prehistoric gender roles was not necessarily built on solid neutral physical evidence in the first place. It was frequently built on the cultural assumptions of the archaeologists doing the interpreting, many of whom were working within 20th century academic and social contexts that already had pretty rigid specific expectations about what natural male and female roles were supposed to look like. Those cultural assumptions got quietly projected backward onto prehistoric data-shaping interpretation in ways that look, with the benefit of modern reanalysis and considerably more rigorous methodology, genuinely unsupported by the actual physical evidence sitting right there in the ground the entire time. Let us bring contemporary hunter-gatherer societies into this conversation as well, because while modern populations obviously cannot perfectly represent deep prehistoric life, studying them does provide genuinely valuable comparative data about how labor actually tends to get distributed in societies operating without industrial technology. Research on groups like the Agta people of the Philippines has specifically documented women actively participating in hunting, including hunting larger game using bows and other tools frequently, while also managing childcare responsibilities simultaneously. This directly contradicts the assumption that hunting and childcare represented some kind of fundamentally incompatible division of labor requiring strict gender separation. This research consistently shows that labor division in traditional non-industrial societies tends to be considerably more flexible, context-dependent, and pragmatically organized around immediate practical needs and individual skill, rather than rigidly fixed along strict gender lines the way a lot of popular imagination has long assumed. Pregnancy and childbirth themselves deserve specific attention in this conversation as well, because they represent an enormous sustained physical demand that gets almost entirely written out of popular strength narratives, despite being, biologically speaking, one of the single most physically demanding processes the human body can undergo. Carrying a pregnancy to term, while continuing the kind of physical labor already discussed, grinding grain, hauling water and firewood, processing hides, and potentially hunting, represents an extraordinary baseline level of physical resilience and cardiovascular capacity that modern populations rarely have to demonstrate under comparable conditions. Childbirth itself, without modern pain management or surgical intervention available as a backup option, required a level of physical endurance and pain tolerance that is genuinely difficult to fully appreciate from a comfortable modern vantage point. Women repeatedly went through this process, sometimes multiple times across a lifetime, while continuing to perform demanding physical labor in the months and years surrounding each individual birth. Let us also bring Entheseal changes into this conversation, specifically because they represent another fascinating type of physical evidence, beyond just general bone density, that researchers use to reconstruct ancient activity patterns. Entheses are the specific points where muscles and tendons attach directly to bone, and these attachment points develop measurable, lasting changes in response to repeated, forceful muscle use over time, essentially leaving a permanent record of exactly which muscles got worked hardest and most consistently throughout a person's life. Studies analyzing entheseal changes in prehistoric female skeletons across multiple sites and time periods have consistently found patterns indicating sustained, intensive upper body and core activity. This again lines up remarkably well with the kind of demanding manual labor profile built throughout this entire discussion, rather than the comparatively passive, low-intensity activity profile the old gathering berries stereotype would actually predict if it were genuinely accurate. It is worth pausing here to address an obvious, fair question. Does all of this risk swinging too far in the opposite direction, essentially replacing one oversimplified stereotype of the passive cavewoman with another oversimplified stereotype of the secretly elite athlete cavewoman, equally flattened and equally lacking in nuance? This is a genuinely important concern, and the honest, careful answer researchers generally land on is more measured than either extreme. The evidence does not suggest every single prehistoric woman was performing at some kind of uniform elite athletic level across every single society and time period that has ever existed. Physical demands obviously varied considerably depending on specific environment, available technology, local subsistence strategy, and individual circumstances, the same way modern physical activity levels vary enormously across different populations and individual life circumstances today. What the evidence does consistently support is a much more accurate, much less flattering to our assumptions picture than the old passive stereotype ever provided. Prehistoric women's bodies were shaped by sustained, demanding, physically significant labor that by any reasonable modern standard would be considered seriously impressive, not some kind of supplementary lower-effort activity happening safely on the margins while men handled all the genuinely physically demanding work. Let us also touch on something important regarding how this entire research area has actually progressed methodologically over time, because the story of how we got here matters almost as much as the findings themselves. Earlier generations of archaeological research frequently lacked the technical tools to perform this kind of detailed biomechanical bone analysis at all, meaning a lot of older interpretive frameworks were built during a period when researchers simply did not have access to the kind of rigorous physical evidence discussed today. As technology and methodology have improved, through CT scanning, more sophisticated statistical modeling, and refined sex determination techniques applied directly to skeletal remains rather than relying purely on associated grave goods, researchers have been able to revisit old assumptions with considerably more rigorous, less culturally biased tools than were ever available previously. This is one of the more encouraging aspects of this entire story, with science actively correcting its own outdated assumptions once better tools and more careful methodology become available, rather than just defending old conclusions indefinitely out of pure institutional inertia. There is also something worth mentioning about how this research connects to broader questions of social structure and status in prehistoric societies. because physical labor and social standing do not always correlate the way modern assumptions might suggest. The fact that prehistoric women performed extraordinarily demanding physical labor does not necessarily tell us anything definitive on its own about their relative social status, autonomy, or decision-making power within their specific societies. Those are genuinely separate questions, requiring their own distinct kinds of evidence, such as burial goods, settlement patterns, and other archaeological indicators researchers use to reconstruct social organization more broadly. What the bone and burial evidence does tell us, clearly and consistently, is that the specific, narrow image of prehistoric women as physically passive, confined to low-effort domestic tasks while men handled literally everything, requiring genuine strength or risk, simply does not hold up against the physical evidence these women's own skeletons left behind. There is also an interesting angle worth bringing into this conversation, involving tool use and craft production. Because plenty of skilled, physically demanding work beyond hunting and grain processing has historically been documented as predominantly women's labor across numerous traditional societies, and a lot of it required genuine strength and technical skill that rarely gets acknowledged in popular depictions. Pottery production, in many documented traditional societies, involved physically demanding processes of kneading and working heavy clay operating manual potter's wheels or coil building techniques requiring sustained hand and arm strength, as well as transporting heavy raw materials and finished products. Textile production similarly required enormous physical investment, spinning fiber for hours, operating manual looms that demanded sustained upper body strength and coordinated full-body movement, sometimes for entire workdays stretched across years of a woman's productive life. These crafts rarely make it into popular cultural depictions of prehistoric life, with anywhere near the same visual drama as a hunting scene. A woman calmly weaving fabric does not translate into quite the same kind of compelling cave painting or museum diorama as a dramatic mammoth hunt. But the actual physical demands involved were genuinely significant, and the cumulative effect on the body over a lifetime of this kind of specialized, repetitive craft labor shows up in the skeletal record in ways that are just as measurable and just as physically significant as anything already discussed. Let us also bring agriculture itself into sharper focus here. Because once farming became the dominant subsistence strategy across much of the ancient world, the physical demands placed on women's bodies arguably intensified rather than decreased compared to earlier hunter-gatherer lifestyles, which runs directly counter to a lot of popular assumptions about agricultural life being somehow gentler or less physically demanding. Early agricultural societies required extensive manual labor for planting, weeding, harvesting, and processing crops, frequently performed by women alongside or instead of men, depending on the specific society and seasonal demands. This came on top of the already extensive domestic labor burden of food preparation, textile production, and childcare already discussed. Some researchers studying the transition from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture have actually proposed that this shift may have increased overall physical labor demands on women specifically, even as it simultaneously reduced certain other risks associated with the more mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle. This is a fascinating trade-off that complicates any simple narrative about agriculture representing unambiguous progress or reduced physical hardship for the women actually living through that transition. It is also worth addressing a specific counterargument that sometimes comes up in response to this entire body of research. The idea that strong bones alone do not necessarily prove women were doing the same specific tasks as men, just that they were doing something physically demanding, is a fair and important point worth taking seriously rather than glossing over. The bone evidence by itself cannot tell us with perfect precision exactly which specific tasks produced which specific loading patterns. That level of detail requires combining the skeletal data with other lines of evidence, including tool wear patterns, residue analysis on tools found in association with specific burials, ethnographic comparison with documented traditional societies performing similar activities, and careful contextual analysis of the broader archaeological site. But even with that appropriate scientific caution built in, the core finding remains robust and difficult to argue against. Whatever specific tasks prehistoric women were performing, those tasks were demonstrably, measurably, significantly more physically demanding than the passive, low-effort domestic stereotype has ever suggested, regardless of the precise, specific activity responsible for producing that particular loading pattern in any individual case. There is a comparative angle worth mentioning involving male skeletal data from the same time periods, because this research is not just about reassessing women's physical capability in isolation. It is also revealing some interesting patterns about how the gap between male and female physical demands may have shifted over different periods of human history. Some research comparing male and female bone strength across different prehistoric and early historic periods has found that the relative difference between male and female upper body strength appears to have been notably smaller in certain earlier populations compared to many later agricultural and industrial populations. This suggests that as specific societies developed more rigid, specialized divisions of labor over time, the physical gap between male and female bodies may have widened specifically because of differing activity patterns, rather than purely reflecting some kind of fixed, unchanging biological baseline. This adds a fascinating wrinkle to the whole conversation, suggesting that even the size of the typical strength gap between men and women that we tend to take for granted today might be considerably more shaped by specific historical labor patterns than most people assume, rather than representing some kind of fixed, universal constant across all of human history. Finally, it is worth touching on how this entire body of research has started meaningfully influencing how museums, documentaries, and educational materials actually depict prehistoric life going forward. Because scientific findings only really matter in a broader cultural sense once they start changing the actual stories we tell each other about our own history. A growing number of museum exhibits and documentary productions have begun actively incorporating this updated, more accurate picture of prehistoric female physical capability and labor participation, moving away from the outdated, passively gathering cave woman trope that dominated popular imagination for the better part of a century. This shift matters for reasons that go well beyond simple historical accuracy for its own sake. The stories we tell about our deep ancestral past inevitably shape, even if subtly, the assumptions we carry forward about what is natural or biologically determined regarding gender and physical capability in the present. This means getting this specific piece of the historical record right carries real, meaningful weight, well beyond the narrow confines of academic archaeology alone. So were cave women stronger than we think? Based on everything, the actual physical evidence consistently shows the honest answer is an unambiguous yes, and not by some small marginal degree either. These were women whose bones were measurably significantly stronger than many trained modern athletes. Women who likely participated in big game hunting at rates far higher than popular imagination ever assumed. Women who performed hours of sustained, demanding manual labor every single day across entire lifetimes, all while frequently managing pregnancy, childbirth, and childcare simultaneously. None of which our cultural shorthand for caveman strength has ever really bothered to include in the picture. And the more you sit with this entire body of evidence, the more the old stereotype starts to look less like an honest reflection of prehistoric reality and more like a reflection of whatever assumptions happen to be culturally convenient for the people doing the interpreting at the time. The bones themselves never actually supported the passive secondary cave woman narrative in the first place. They were simply waiting, quite literally embedded in dense, reinforced, heavily loaded skeletal structure for researchers with the right tools and the right willingness to actually look closely enough to notice what had been there the entire time.